Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to unpack a seriously fascinating piece of source material that offers a vigorous conservative defense of Iowa's current political landscape. We're going to explore exactly how this text pushes back against recent progressive critiques, detail the arguments behind the state's most fiercely debated policies, and then trace how those foundational ideals bleed directly into the upcoming gubernatorial race. It's a deep dive into the rhetoric, the policies, and the personalities shaping the state right now. Let's get into it. Here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll be debating Will Hoyt's Law. Second, looking at education and social policies. Third, agriculture, environment, and guns. Fourth, Zach Lawn's Iowa First platform. And finally, we'll wrap up with the gubernatorial race.
All right, Section 1, Debating Will Hoyt's Law. So the text kicks things off by addressing a concept known as Will Hoyt's Law. A liberal critic named Nick Covington actually uses this exact idea to accuse Iowa Republicans of some pretty profound hypocrisy. The accusation here is that the state's policies are designed purely to favor a specific in-group, think conservative Christians or big agribusiness, while actively binding an out-group and basically telling them to just pack up and leave the state if they don't like it. But here's the thing. The source pushes back hard on this, straight up calling that characterization a partisan caricature. Instead of some malicious conspiracy against outgroups, the source argues that these state policies are actually just the result of democratic choices. They reflect a prioritization of things like parental rights, religious liberty, and economic realities in what is a genuinely pluralistic state. The author really stresses that, all governance involves priorities and trade-offs. To them, true conservatism is about ordered liberty, not selective tyranny.
Moving right along to Section 2, Education and Social Policies. Now, the source takes the progressive critique on education absolutely head-on. Where critics see the students' first ESA voucher program as this unregulated drain on public schools, the text defends it as a totally necessary, empowering alternative for parents, especially when you look at declining reading and math proficiency in public schools. And on the super debated topic of restricting DEI teachings in certain books, the source frames those not as sectarian bans, but as completely reasonable, neutral guardrails. The goal, according to the text, is simply to prevent ideological capture and keep explicit adult themes away from young kids in taxpayer-funded institutions. That number you see right there, 6, represents a massive flashpoint. It's the 6-week limit in Iowa's fetal heartbeat bill. The text defends this timeline as a post-Dobbs democratic choice, one that reflects the views of many Iowans who believe unborn life deserves protection the moment cardiac activity is detectable. The source also makes a point to emphasize that this legislation isn't meant to be uniquely punitive. They note that critical exceptions explicitly exist for rape, incest, and the life of the mother, really framing the whole thing as a balancing of rights rather than a denial of women's flourishing. When it comes to the deeply sensitive issue of gender-affirming care for minors, the source justifies Iowa's restrictions by actually pointing across the pond to the UK's Cass review. The text makes the argument that limiting puberty blockers and hormones for youth isn't rooted in bigotry at all. Rather, it's an act of medical prudence. The source highlights that the Cass review found weak evidence, poor quality studies, and totally unknown long-term effects regarding bone health and cognition. Basically, they're arguing that blanket affirmation of these treatments just isn't settled science. All right, Section 3, Agriculture, Environment, and Guns. This brings us to that core argument of trade-offs we mentioned earlier. When talking about agriculture, the author straight up admits that CAFOs, those are concentrated animal feeding operations, and nitrates in the water are very real, serious challenges. However, the text strongly warns against demonizing the agricultural industry. Why? Well, because of that trade-off. This industry sustains rural communities, employs thousands of people, and literally feeds the world. So the source advocates for better management and targeted rules rather than moralizing attacks against big ag, pointing out that we have to balance the desire for pristine water with the real-world need for affordable food and economic vitality. Switching gears to firearms, the source takes on critics of Iowa's constitutional carry laws. The text asserts that allowing constitutional carry doesn't inherently cause harm or lead to some massive proliferation of violence. To back this up, the author points out that Iowa actually maintains one of the lowest overall gun death rates in the entire nation. The core argument here is that enforcing secure storage and focusing on lawful behavior matters way more than treating fundamental constitutional rights like mere privileges that need to be restricted. Which brings us to Section 4, Zach Lawn's Iowa First. Yep, another 6, but this time it refers to gubernatorial candidate Zach Lawn being a proud 6th-generation Iowan.
The text intentionally highlights this fact to counter what it calls emotional framing and shallow partisan talking points from his critics. By really emphasizing his status as a sixth-generation resident, the source is validating his deep, authentic, historical roots in the state. It's a direct pushback against any narrative trying to paint him as some kind of out-of-touch outsider. And this historical connection is pretty fascinating. It goes all the way back to 1862 when an ancestor of his served in Iowa's 2nd Cavalry. But look at the modern era. In 2005, his family's 105-year farming legacy actually had to be sold. Then, a decade later, Lon founds Homeplace Ventures and manages to repurchase the nearly 700-acre Belle Plaine farm. The source uses this specific narrative to show his profound personal commitment to rural revitalization, highlighting that he has firsthand experience with the pain of agricultural loss. As an entrepreneur, Lon channels that Iowa First political platform directly into three main investment pillars through his firm, Homeplace Ventures. In agriculture, he actively supports independent family farms and resists large agribusiness monopolies. Over in real estate, a core tenet for him is preventing foreign and out-of-state ownership of Iowa land, while also restoring historic local sites, like the King Theater, for example. And in technology, he focuses heavily on driving rural efficiency. According to the text, these aren't just business strategies for him. They're vital tools to preserve the state's cultural and economic independence. Beyond that, the source also highlights his role in education. As a father of 7 in a blended family, Lon actually co-founded Wonder School, which is this innovative, Socratic K-12 private school. The text uses this to directly counter claims that Lon would be a disaster for public schools. Instead, the author argues this simply shows his desire to strengthen the entire education ecosystem through innovation, strong values, and healthy competition, rather than him just wanting to defund public education. And finally, Section 5, the gubernatorial race. Now, the text draws a really stark contrast here between Lon and his opponent. It characterizes Rob Sand's resume as comparatively shallow, pointing out his heavy reliance on government bureaucracy as a career prosecutor and a 2-term state auditor, with 0 real-world farming or business ownership experience. This is positioned directly against Lon, who brings hands-on private sector agricultural and entrepreneurial experience to the table. The source argues that this kind of background is absolutely necessary to truly understand the real-world challenges that everyday Iowans face. But the critique of Sand definitely doesn't stop there. The text points to his staggering $18.3 million in campaign finances to raise some pretty serious conflict of interest questions. A massive $11.5 million of that total comes directly from his wife's incredibly wealthy Lordson family, who happen to be a major player in Iowa's livestock and agricultural processing industry. The text argues that, honestly, this looks a lot less like grassroots democracy and a lot more like a wealthy family attempting to just purchase influence over the exact sector the governor is supposed to regulate. So, what does this all mean? Ultimately, the source leaves us at a fundamental ideological crossroads. As you evaluate these deeply contrasting visions of governance, the policies they produce, and the specific candidates championing them, you have to ask yourself, which path do you actually believe leads to a healthier, more prosperous future for the state? Does true flourishing require enforcing progressive standards, or does it thrive under the ordered liberty and practical trade-offs of an Iowa First approach? That's the ultimate question at the heart of this explainer. Thanks so much for joining me today, and keep questioning the ideas behind the policies that shape our world.